his arse. Something to aim for next year, Dr. Graham. He turned and raised a brow toward his muscular Englishman. Oh, I'd say you've got perfect aim already, darling. The electric lights flicked on, and his dear Dr. Cockburn blushed a shade more suited to a rosebush than a professor of psychology. But there was no time to think, because Trixie pulled him by the arm into the sitting room, cleared out for dancing. 3 songs went by, and Ainsley needed to mop his brow with his hanky before he was able to sidle back up to Joachim and enjoy a piece of cake, spoon-fed into his waiting mouth. A hunk of icing dangled on his lips for a half-second before Joachim licked it off with a wink. That was mine. Joachim stood close enough to cause comment if anyone in the room had been the sort to do such a thing. There'll be plenty of cake left for me to roll around in when our guests leave. Ainsley found himself not pouting again. I think perhaps it's me who ought to be covered in it, don't you think? It's not my birthday, but I'm happy either way. Christ on a stick. Being in love was absurd. But lovely just the same. Dr. Graham, I'd like to bend your ear for a tick if you've got the time. The head of the history department, Bernard Tompkins, peered up at Ainsley through his thick lenses that magnified his eyes twice the usual size for a human. Bend your ear always sounded painful. But as Dr. Tompkins said it in nearly every conversation they'd ever had since Ainsley got his old lecturer position back 2 years previous, Ainsley no longer visibly winced when he heard it. Joachim, who couldn't keep a secret, tried to hide his grin. Though perhaps he could keep a secret, as Ainsley hadn't actually had an inkling there was going to be a surprise party, and there must have been a lot of planning considering the scope of the decorations. What else didn't he know about? For months, his Geordie had moaned that they'd spent all their time together on Ainsley's home turf. In a moment of weakness, Ainsley had agreed that the 2 of them could spend a few months someplace else, even though it was silly. Anything that belonged to Ainsley, like his Austin motor car or either of his 2 houses, he happily shared with his lover. Why couldn't Joachim get that through his thick skull? But now this was it. He'd finally learn which esteemed university was willing to overlook his academic past and agreed to have him as a visiting professor of folklore for the summer. Oh, and would also tack on a position for Joachim's lectures on treating brain fidgets, because Ainsley would hardly go without him. He'd made that very clear in his application letters. Paris? Wouldn't that be a feather in his cap? God, it might prove once and for all that his career was back on track. That he had won back his reputation as a serious academic, rather than being known as a crackpot who chatted with ghosts. Possibly Berlin. That was said to be a right old place since the end of the damned war, even if it was filled with bloody Germans. But still, Paris would be best. Being a guest lecturer at the Sorbonne would enhance his CV very nicely. Even his darling Cockburn would finally recognize that he was a sensible adult. At least, he could be when he tried. Oh, or even Athens. Hadn't they applied to go to Athens? Greeks were absolutely reliable as serious thinkers. Nothing superficial about Greece. Well, except all those well-built men in togas. Though they wouldn't be wearing those anymore, would they? He ought to hint that next year's birthday party could be a fancy dress sort. Joachim would be perfect in a toga. Or better yet, one of those wee loincloth jobs that wouldn't leave much to his imagination. Gracious. Ainsley might need to figure out a reason for costumes on his own and not wait an entire year for that particular treat. Dr. Graham? Joachim tapped his shoulder, bringing Ainsley out of his reverie. He blinked twice as though he'd been present throughout. Yes, I'm waiting. The anticipation buzzed in his stomach. He would have gone on a grand tour when he was younger, except the war had been on. A conflagration that left behind a devastated Europe, which was too dismal for words. Therefore, at the ripe old, seasoned age of 29, and really he needed to do the math on that because 29 sounded much older than he felt. Ainsley Graham